I think everybody knows Bob Lawrence. Bob Lawrence is someone who has been involved with Physicians for Human Rights for many years, was on the board and a founding member. Bob.
Thank you. Thanks, Lynn and Court. It was very moving and very disturbing. Just a quick fact, the denominator for all of these rates, what was the Syrian population 4 years ago? 18 million. So
use the microphone, please.
18 million is the total population in Syria. So 12 million out of 18 million are conflict affected, 7.6 million internally displaced. And you've seen the numbers of known violent deaths are more than 250,000.
Mm-hmm. So just imagine our country if 40% of us were internally displaced or seeking refuge. I mean, that puts it in such stark terms. You very carefully, both of you, eliminated in your talk any mention of the Shia-Sunni conflict, which is obviously at the heart of where Assad is getting his support for the Alawite regime. No wonder that the Gulf states that are predominantly Sunni have not stepped forward. Do you see any solution to that? Do you think it's realistic that they would welcome predominantly Shia refugees?
I think the issue of religious sectarianism, whether it's within Islam or whether, as we've seen in Europe, many countries saying we are a Christian nation, we will maybe accept Christians but not Muslims, I think is something that we cannot ignore. I suppose perhaps in the interest of time and maybe in the interest of not confronting this directly, we didn't speak to that, but I think it's something that clearly is coloring, if you will, all of the responses, both by countries in the region as well as by Europe and maybe other countries as well. I think the World Vision director spoke to that when they pitched an appeal for Nepal. They got, I think, something like $10 million in a few weeks, and for Syria over several years they've gotten only $2.7 million. There is, if you will, Islamophobia affecting how countries outside of the Middle East response, and within the Middle East there are certainly issues that you speak to in terms of Sunni-Shia divisions. I think it's no question that there are, among the so-called rebel factions in Syria, two of the actors are Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So there are bad actors on the other side, and we have to be aware of those realities, but somehow I feel we have to step up and do more and think globally about these problems and not only from the perspective of national interests and, as it will, ethnic politics and so forth. It really is necessary to do more than that. How realistic those opportunities and possibilities are, I can't say. We have a very real challenge at hand, and it's a global one. And the idea of sort of religious sectarianism and division and suspicion is just one more element that is making a response to this and solutions to this crisis even more complex.
So we'll take one more question over there, please.
So you mentioned the Gulf states, but I was also curious about Russia and China, who have notoriously blocked UN Security Council in terms of doing any action against the Assad regime. But I haven't heard them talk about how they can help the people that they're partially helping to force out of their country. How can we make a difference to having Russia start engaging in taking refugees, their response? The same also goes for China, but Russia seems to be even more at the forefront now that they're potentially going to start actively engaging with Assad.
Well, this is getting into the area that we want to avoid, but I think we can say that Russia is even more than China, but China as well, but Russia especially is responsible for prolonging the war, not resolving it. And even though there is now the supposed diplomatic initiative by Putin, it's accompanied by military support of the regime. So I don't think we can count on Russia to do anything to help the refugees or show any respect for their human rights. It's very unfortunate, and as you said, they've blocked all Security Council resolutions that would require any kind of accountability for the actions of the Assad regime.
Let me just add, and I should have mentioned China before. I don't know exactly where they stand on the list of international donors, but I certainly know they're not in the top 10. This is either the #1 economy in the world or #2. I can't remember if we're 1 or they're 2, but they have massive amounts of resources, and I think they're on the sidelines on this issue. They're not actively involved in the conflict as Russia is, but I certainly think China needs to step up its game and make much more substantial commitments to the international appeals for both refugees and others outside their country, as well as for assistance to those displaced and affected by conflict inside. Whether they do resettlement, I certainly think they can and have done. Again, they took 150,000 Vietnamese, little known fact, after the Vietnamese conflict. So they've done that, and those populations have resettled successfully. So it's time again for the globe to step up and not look for those typical actors or usual suspects to say, well, these are the resettlement countries of the past, let's let them take the resettlement burdens. Everybody needs to stand up and say, we want to commit our fair share of resources, financial resources, as well as commitments for resettlement assistance of affected populations.
Great, thank you.